Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bujan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and I'd like to welcome you to this special presentation of the 1944 version of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Tonight, our special guest is author and film historian Stan Shaffer. How are you doing tonight, Stan?
I'm fine, and how about you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves stars the infamous Queen of Technicolor, Maria Montez. How did you first fall in love with Maria Montez?
Back in the day, many years ago, they actually used to run movies in the afternoon instead of talk shows. And there was a show called The Early Show, and they ran Maria Montez movies one week. And it was just as a young kid, it was just like, oh my God, she is so beautiful. She is so stunning. And and the movies were fun. So they just bring you right on into you know, it's a fantasy land, basically. And her accent, when you're so enthralled with someone like we were with her at that point, it didn't matter at all. You still understood everything because you were so taken by her. That was
Right.
her greatest talent, was probably her beauty.
And she was gorgeous, and especially at that time that you have a woman, a strong Latina woman who was born in the Dominican Republic, who could become so commercially successful and loved by audiences at that time. I think that's certainly of note.
Well, it helps the escapism needed for World War II. The
Hmm.
timing was perfect. The producer was a man named Walter Wanger, who was a great producer, had done movies like You Only Live Once. He also did Stagecoach with John Ford. And so he came with a new Universal contract and actually got Universal to put up more money than they usually would because Universal was like full of a lot of black and white, old, low budget movies at that time.
Right, which I'm a
And
big fan. I'm a big fan of the Universal monster movies, so I am aware of their B
me
movie.
too.
Yeah.
And though he convinced them to do this, and she at that point was a actress of not much stature. She had appeared as one of the models in The Invisible Woman with John Barrymore and Virginia Bruce, and then she made a really wonderful, little interesting basic Universal, an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe called The Mystery of Marie Roget, and she played Marie Roget, and she's sort of a villainess in it, but not really, because she makes believe she sets it up as if she was murdered, and then we find out she really wasn't murdered, and then later on she does get murdered.
Yeah.
So it's all set up, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And then of course Wanger saw that, and then we got Arabian Nights, which was the first of this series of movies.
Hmm. And Arabian Nights is notable because it was the first time she was paired up with her famous leading man, Jon Hall.
Yes. And Jon Hall had a good career already before this coming in. One of his earliest movies was actually a Charlie Chan movie at Fox called Charlie Chan in Shanghai, and he's billed under his original name of Charles Locker at that point. But then, as fate would have it, John Ford found him, and it was a whole different ballpark then.
Yeah.
Um, he was the main star in a movie called The Hurricane that John Ford made for Samuel Goldwyn, and a co-star of the what should we say the princess that time of these kind of exotic things, Dorothy Lamour, and she was
Mhm.
the primary star in it. And it's a very good movie. Well, not one of the greatest Fords, but a very good Ford, and
Sure.
that made him a star.
Yeah, and I was always a fan of John Hall, again, as a fan of the Universal monster movies. I know him best as the Invisible Man in the 1940s.
Yes.
And he's wonderful in those films. Something in my research I thought was fascinating. So, the reason Arabian Nights and Alibaba and the 40 Thieves were made in the first place was due to the immense popularity of Alexandra Korda's remake of The Thief of Baghdad in 1940. This beautiful Technicolor fantasy film, which it was kind of a watershed film because in the 1940s there was a whole genre of Arabian Nights themed films. One thing I thought was interesting was that there are newspaper articles from 1939 where Alexandra Korda announces that Jon Hall was cast as the lead of The Thief of Baghdad. But for whatever reason, I think Samuel Goldwyn decided to pull the contract.
Makes
So
sense.
it never came into fruition. But I do think it's ironic that he was announced as the lead of the film. But I guess, sort of as a consolation prize, he did end up doing many of these Middle Eastern themed adventure films in the 40s.
Now, eventually, he left Goldwyn and then started Universal. And the two Invisible movies were Invisible Agent and Invisible Man's Revenge that he made there. So he became, he stayed at Universal for a while throughout
Yeah.
the mid 40s.
And definitely the Universal connection. Our third billed actor of the film is a personal favorite of mine, Turhan Bey.
Yes, I am with you on that very much. My first introduction to him was also back as a kid when they ran all the Universal horror movies, and it was The Mummy's Tomb. And he impressed me too much, very much as the young priest who was trying to follow orders and keep Kyrus alive, and listen to the original orders issued to him by George Zucco, one of the also great Universal actors, and then Tarampe. But see, before Tarampe did The Mummy's Tomb, he was over at Warner Brothers and made a little movie called Shadows on the Stairs, with Frida and Escort, and he always played, well, we want to use that word again, maybe exotic types, because he was born in Vienna, but his father was Turkish, his mother was Jewish. So it was this, and then he was known as a hot Turk at that point. And
I
but he
think
always played like the assistant to the villain. He wasn't the main villain. He was like a henchman.
Well, I thought it was interesting too. Yeah, his nickname at the time, I believe, was the Turkish Delight. That's how they built him
Yes.
in a lot of these
Yes.
films. But he's a lot of fun. And so the film itself, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, of course, is based on one of the most famous stories from the Thousand and One Nights collection. But what may be interesting to some people is that it was a very late edition, and it may or may not have any origins in the Middle East whatsoever. So the Thousand and One Nights originally existed in its purest form in pre-Islamic Persia. So during the rise of Islam, they were really big into philosophy, education, history. They translated a lot of these ancient works into Arabic for the first time, and they would add various stories. But two of the most famous stories, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves and Aladdin and His Wonderful Lamp, were not added to the collection of works until the 18th century. There was a French anthropologist and historian. His name was Antoine Galland. He was the first European to translate these works for a European audience. Of course, in France in the 1700s, they were immensely popular. People couldn't get enough of them, so you got to the point where it's like we have to start adding stories. We need to start creating new stories. One of Antoine Galland's associates was he was a Christian Syrian scholar. His name was Hana Diab, and he was staying in Paris at the time. And he shared these stories with Antoine Galland, but they were oral traditions, so they may or may not have been the brainchild of the Syrian storyteller. They may or may not have been the creation of this French translator anthropologist. But as far as we know, there is no original Arabic or Persian text for Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves.
I had no idea that. That's very interesting. Now, was Sinbad part of that group too at that point? Did that come in later, or how did he figure in?
Now, Sinbad is interesting because Sinbad, it was one of the later editions. I don't think it was added to the collection of stories until maybe the 18th or 19th centuries. However, there are earlier existing texts. I think maybe it was a separate collection of stories. I think there's an early Turkish translation which predates the French editions. So Sinbad does have a little bit more authenticity to it. As wonderful as this film is, it should be noted that it does shift away from the original story quite a bit and reframe it as it's a Robin Hood adventure. It's Robin Hood and his merry men fighting against the oppressors for liberty. With that in mind, it's a lot of fun. From 1944, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Please stick around after the film for our post show conversation. I hope you enjoy the film. Well, that was a lot of fun.
Oh, great fun. What a beautiful movie to just so appealing cinematography too, besides Miss Montez.
Yeah. I mean, the film at that time, I mean, it may not be the most artistically profound film made in that genre or in that era, but I mean, all those Technicolor adventure films, the Marie Montez films, they're a lot of fun.
Yes.
And they're
Yeah,
gorgeous to look
especially
at.
well, especially Alibaba and Arabian Nights. They actually are a little bit a step above some of the others, I
Right.
would say. Alibaba is certainly entertaining. And what a great group of actors beyond the three
Yeah.
we've mentioned. One of the major actors in it is Andy Devine. And Andy Devine was usually added as like a comic relief in many movies. He was under contract at Universal at that point and just made a series of like adventure comedy romps with an actor named Richard Arlen. And
Yeah.
they were very popular in the early 40s as also escapist fare.
Andy Devine's great. He's a lot of fun to watch in this as well. But the film is directed by Arthur Lubin, who at the time was famous for his Abbott and Costello comedies. He directed a personal favorite of mine, which is the 1943 version of Phantom of the Opera, and
Yes.
very
With Claude
underrated.
Rains.
Claude Rains is magnificent in that very underrated film. But like Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, the man knew how to frame a beautiful Technicolor shot.
In fact, I think Phantom was nominated for an Oscar for cinematography
Right. And
for
it's
that
kind of
year.
and it's fun if you get to watch this movie back to back with Phantom of the Opera, you'll notice a lot of the same Mongolian costumes and props and things. And I believe even the cave of the 40 Thieves is the Phantom's lair repurposed as this
Oh,
yeah, it was redressed. You can notice a lot of the same kind of architecture.
that's Universal.
That's universal. They knew
They
how to
made sure
spend.
every penny counted.
So what was the response like at the time for these films?
Well, first, they didn't know where they were not going to think about with Arabian Nights pushing her because, of course, at that point she was a star. So it's more about Jon Hall, and that's the only one in which Jon Hall has billing over her. Is the first one, Arabian Nights.
Yeah,
Then after that time, once the males started coming in, not just from young men that would love her, but also from women. And then later on, she also became very popular with the troops. In fact, at one point, I forget his name, but she was actually engaged with a soldier. And so
mhm,
there was a lot of publicity there because Maria was always looking for an opportunity for publicity,
yeah,
always. And she knew how to work it and generate it herself. She'd appear at restaurants where no one even knew she was showing up. She'd make sure she was at parties. She was a publicity machine for herself.
yeah.
And she was very she even said that one of her greatest things she loved to do is she looked in the mirror and she would say, "I'm so beautiful. I'm so happy. I'm so beautiful." And that's what she would do. And she was so in love with herself and believed it that she convinced all of us. And we didn't even need much convincing because she was so gorgeous.
I mean, she was gorgeous, but I think we all know somebody like that in our own personal lives.
Yes, we do. And,
Yeah.
and then the other with her ego is that at one point in an interview early on, she said, "Well, the next thing I want is within 5 years, I'm going to win an Oscar." And I'm very stubborn. When I set my mind on something, I get it.
Hmm.
You got to give her
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of hoopla there for her chutzpah.
And I don't blame it, especially when you're a young woman, you're an immigrant, and you're trying to make it in this cutthroat industry. You have to have that level of confidence, and you have to fight for yourself. So, but that can be a double-edged
Very,
sword. Yeah.
yes, and she never stopped that. There's various times as to when she was born. When she first started, she was officially much younger than she was, and she actually was married before the movies were even made and had divorced him. He was
Mhm.
an Irish businessman. But then she came to America and she landed in New York, started doing some modeling, and made her way to LA. And in LA, then she had like a second lead in a Johnny Mac Brown Western to begin
Yeah.
with. And then the smaller roles until Marie Roget.
Yeah. Well, and she certainly blew up overnight. Why do you think Maria Montez isn't as well known as a household name now as maybe some of her other contemporaries?
Well, part of it is because the Universal package was not shown as often as, let's say, Warner Brothers on television during the 50s and 60s when they started showing movies. And then they started showing hers, like I said, that's why I saw on the early show. And then she's been gone now for 1951. It's a long, long time.
And that's something that we should point out too. Unfortunately, two of the three of our main stars of the film, they had pretty tragic endings and
Yes,
untimely endings.
yes,
So how did Maria
yes.
Montez pass away?
Well, she had this treatment that she loved to do, where she'd always make sure she took these really steaming hot baths. She was concerned that she had like a target weight of 125 pounds that she wanted to keep at all times. And part of that regimen was that she would take these hot baths. Now, earlier in the day, she did say that she felt like she was a little off, and she said so she has to watch herself. And then later, she went and took this bath, and she died of a heart attack there at the age of only 39. Her
As far as
sisters
we
found
know,
her.
as far as we know, to the age of 39, right? We don't know.
Right. Well, she would tell us that she was actually only 34, perhaps 31.
Yeah, but that's an awful way.
It devastated her husband. She was married to a really fine actor, Jean-Pierre Aumont, who
Mhm.
had an MGM contract and who had been a major fighter working for the French resistance during the war. So
Yeah,
this devastated him because he was very young too.
yeah. And John Hall had a pretty tragic ending as well.
Well, see, when these movies were finished and he had moved on and his star went a little bit downhill, he was smart enough to get into television early on, and he made a show called Ramar of the Jungle, which was very popular in the early 50s. They even made at that point sometimes they'd take episodes of movies, I mean TV shows, and make them into movies,
Mhm.
and they would do that with some of the Ramar. And then after that, things slid downhill One of his last movies he made was a movie called The Horrors of Party Beach, and he also directed it.
Yeah.
So his career was just not doing well at all, and he came down with cancer of the bladder,
Oh.
and unfortunately, he committed suicide because it was so horrible.
And it's sad, and but in a lot of ways, that's why watching these films is like a time capsule. They're always going to be young and beautiful.
Yes, and that's a great thing, as Harambe was. Now, Harambe aged pretty well. He left. What happened with Harambe was with the men gone, for the war, he was one of the ones who actually it worked in his favor. And so he got to do Dragon Seed opposite Katharine Hepburn, uh, a Night in Paradise, Merle Oberon. So he got major leagues. But then once the men came back and the 40s started happening, his career wasn't strong enough to maintain that position. Mid 50s, he left Hollywood. He became an internationally known photographer, even going to archaeological sites. And then he returned to acting years later in something called Sequest. And he also did a couple guest shots on Murder She Wrote.
Okay, but he lived a fairly long time, right?
Yeah, I think he lived to be 90.
Oh wow. Yeah, I think I remember just a few years ago he passed away. Um, but
And he did maintain his looks. He was a
yeah.
very, very good looking older man when he was older. So it worked for him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's always good to hear. At least one of our stars had a happier ending than the other one.
Yes, yes.
I think it's actually interesting to point out too. So last week's film, we showed the original version of The Thief of Baghdad from 1924, which that film also does a very fantastical fictionalized portrayal of the Mongol invasion of Baghdad, as this film does. One thing I think it's interesting to note is this is based on an actual historical episode. So in 1258, the Mongolian hordes led by the real Hulagu Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, who was an actual Mongol leader, they raided and sacked all of Persia, and Baghdad was the capital of the Islamic world, so that was sort of the crown jewel. They ended up burning Baghdad to the ground. There was the House of Wisdom, which was their library of ancient texts from all over the world. That was completely burned. They said that the rivers of Baghdad they turned black with all of the ink from all the books that they destroyed.
Oh
So
my God.
there was a lot of culture that was lost. So that was sort of a turning point in 1258 as they it signaled the end of the Islamic Golden Age, which at that time it was the Renaissance of the Middle Eastern culture essentially. And it is interesting that it did provide such entertaining fodder in some of these famous adventure films of the 20th century.
Right. Yeah. And the original Thief of Baghdad is such a brilliant movie. Fairbanks did such a phenomenal job on every aspect.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts on Alibaba and the 40 Thieves?
It's just a beautiful, beautiful movie. Anyone who has a chance to see that or Arabian Nights should make sure to take the opportunity, just let go of everything else and just sit back and be entertained. Don't decide to try to attach any great critical analysis to it. Just enjoy it. That's Maria Montez. That's what you can say about Maria Montez. Just sit back and enjoy her.
She's she's gorgeous, and I'm sure all of us got to enjoy her tonight. Thank you so much, Mr. Stan Shaffer. Is there anything else you'd like to plug? Do you have any upcoming projects?
I'm working presently on a book on pre-code movies. That's the movies made between 1929 and 1934, and I hope to finish it next year.
All right, and I'm sure we all look forward to reading it. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. I hope you have a good night.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.